Well, Canada's sovereign has always had a special relationship with the Indigenous peoples of this country. Seen as a guardian of the treaties signed with the First Nations, King Charles acknowledged the relationship in this week's speech from the throne, acknowledging his own journey of reconciliation while encouraging Canadians to continue theirs.
I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. This land acknowledgement is a recognition of shared history as a nation, while continuing to deepen my own understanding. It is my great hope that in each of your communities and collectively as a country, a path is found toward truth and reconciliation in both word and deed.
Well, for more, we're now joined by Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Chief, good to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So we just heard the King in the Senate earlier this week, which I'll ask you about later because you did have a meeting with the King. But you, right now, have just come out of a meeting with the Prime Minister. I'm wondering how that went because this is the first time in this parliamentary session that you've actually met with the Prime Minister. What did you talk about?
Well, I congratulated the Prime Minister on his election, and it was a chance to also congratulate him on a successful royal visit, as well as the speech from the throne that for the first time in the history of this country had free, prior, and informed consent in it. I'd also congratulated him on appointing 2 First Nations women to cabinet. I think that's huge. And we also talked about the urgent situation regarding forest fires in the prairies, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and in Ontario, and to make sure that, that the chiefs that are calling, that they're getting the support that they need for the community. So we conveyed that message very strongly. Mm-hmm. We also talked about urgent legislative and policy priorities, particularly related to clean water legislation and First Nations policing. We really need access to policing services on First Nations across the country. And we also talked about the Team Canada, that we talked about Trump and the tariffs and the need to include First Nations formally in these national discussions. Currently, we're not.
Yeah.
Particularly with First Ministers. It's not Team Canada in 2025 without First Nations at the table.
Well, let's talk about a few of those matters, beginning with the concerns and the needs of Indigenous communities in this country. Because yesterday you did have a news conference where you talked about this infrastructure gap with Indigenous communities in this country. Clean water, yes, but also schools and homes. I'm wondering if you received any type of commitment whatsoever from the Prime Minister that he would move forward and address these issues.
We had a commitment on homes for sure for First Nations, but I think it's got to be more than that. I was able to restate that closing the discriminatory First Nations infrastructure gap should be the #1 national building project. This gap has perpetuated deep-rooted inequality in Canada, particularly related to safe schools for our kids, to access to clean water for our kids, to modern schools, to access to high-speed internet, very, very basic things, all-season roads and other issues that Canadians take for granted. Many First Nations children and people and elders don't have access to those things. And this disparity has led to poorer health outcomes, limited education opportunities, as you can imagine, and much less to that than compared to other Canadians. So we made the point that if the government's vision for First Nations infrastructure is focused exclusively on accessing natural resources, that they have another thing coming. We need to start with the basics to make sure that basic human rights are being met. And what better way to mark the 10th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliations Commission than closing Canada's shameful infrastructure gap once and for all?
Mm-hmm. And how did he respond to that?
Well, he was taking notes, and we had a long discussion. We're going to be having further meetings with our leadership and himself, as well as with his ministers. So we're going to be working on that and finding a date for that.
Okay, so you and I will speak again as that date approaches and as that meeting happens. But you also talked about these national projects, because we do know that this is something that the government wants to pursue, national projects vis-a-vis natural resources. Do you see that as a boon for Indigenous people in this country or a danger?
Well, I can't even comment on that because we have not seen this legislation, just a brief outline, uh, just a brief outline. So we will wait to see the full package. That being said, we are concerned about what we are seeing and hearing from government so far, based on what I'm hearing, and about similar proposals in Ontario, in British Columbia, and Alberta. So we fear that this may not end well. We won't beat Trump's colonialism with more colonialism here at home. And I fear that is what we are seeing with this fast track proposals approach. We promised the Prime Minister we will provide a more formal response that lists the concerns we are hearing and observing with this current approach. And we will be consulting chiefs and providing that to them very soon. At the same time, I told the Prime Minister that nation building projects he should fast track is right in front of him, closing the First Nations infrastructure gap.
And to be clear for people at home, you're still waiting for details on the federal approach. What you're referencing right now are the provincial efforts to try to fast track developments in their own regions. So, again, we'll watch that along with you. But you also talk about sitting down with the premiers, and that's interesting because for people who don't know, next week in Saskatoon, there will be a meeting of the First Ministers. In the past, you've expressed your frustration that there never is Indigenous leadership around that table when the premiers meet. I'm wondering if you raised that specifically with the Prime Minister and whether or not you asked to be invited to Saskatoon this year.
I did raise that, and I feel for previous national chiefs before myself who were never invited to any of these big discussions. And it's 2025. It's time that First Nations have a full seat at the table. You cannot leave them out when you're talking about infrastructure or healthcare, and you want to divvy up and do healthcare with each other with the premiers, but they all play politics with it all the time and try and push First Nations to the sidelines. And we need to get over that and make this country a better place for all of us. The King was here this past week to show, and this country was made because First Nations signed treaties with the Crown at the time to create this beautiful country that we're supposed to be creating. We're still a young country. Let's get it right and make space for First Nations at the table.
Will there be space made for you in Saskatoon, though?
I have not heard.
Okay, not yet heard. Although, let's get back to the King, though, because, of course, before you and I were speaking, we heard the King in the Senate delivering the throne speech. And in the portion, just one of many portions of that speech where he did reference Canada's Indigenous, Inuit and Métis people, First Nations people, in that one reference with the land acknowledgement, he himself acknowledged that he was still on the path of learning and encouraged Canadians to continue their path on the road to reconciliation. How important do you think that was to hear, not only for Indigenous peoples in this country, but for other people in this country as well, to hear that kind of message from the head of state?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I think, like I said, we're a young country, and I think that we all have to learn about each other. I mean, I lived in a First Nation where, I was I'm happy that I grew up on a First Nation community, but coming off that, I had to learn about other cultures as well. And I'm so glad that I've met so many wonderful Canadians from coast to coast to coast with their families to try and understand each other and where we're coming from. And I know many times when I would explain being a First Nations person that we're First Nations, like the Inuit aren't subjected to this, neither are the Métis, but First Nations people, the 1.5 million people in Canada, were the only people legislated around the entire world through the Indian Act. And the Indian Act was after the signing of treaties, like a decade later in the House of Commons. And it's created an unjust society for First Nations in this country. And if we want to make, we're still, look at it, it's 2025, we're still talking about access to clean drinking water for First Nations children and access to basic things like the internet for First Nations children and roads and schools and homes. And so we have a long way to go in this young country that we all share, but we all need to learn from each other, work together, and talk to each other. And nobody's leaving nobody's leaving this country. We have to try and get along and find a way forward to make this country a more wholesome, better place for each and every one of us.
And before we go, I do want to ask, because you asked for and did receive a private audience with the King. I'm wondering what you shared with King Charles.
Well, I was wearing a treaty medal. I don't have it with me today, but I was wearing a treaty medal, and on the treaty medal, on one side was his great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, and the treaty medal was, when treaties were entered into, was gifted to my grandfather, my ancestor, Chief Richard Woodhouse, back on August 21st, 1871. So we talked about that and creating this peaceful country. We never went to war with each other. And we entered into treaty together. And so we had a long discussion on treaties. We had a long discussion on sustainable development goals. We had a long discussion on, furthering our relationship together, and that I'm hoping that I take it, work with him and for a further meeting. And so I'm looking forward to that.
Well, I wish you well in that conversation and in your next meeting with the King, Cindy. But listen, for our conversation this evening, thank you for all the update. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too.